Alrighty, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Gloria Blackwell, the Chief Executive Officer at AAUW, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar with another wonderful AAUW Fellowships alumna. Just a reminder that today's program is being recorded and it will be available on the AAUW website at aauw.org. Please do use the chat box if you have any technical questions, or the question box if you'd like to ask any questions. We are really looking forward to an amazing conversation with our alumna. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to introduce AAUW International Fellowships alumna, Dr. Pempho Chinkondenji. She is an associate professor of education, health, and behavior at the University of North Dakota. Dr. Chinkondenji is a scholar, educator, and practitioner-activist in the field of comparative and international education. Her scholarly practice, teaching, and advocacy for social justice lie at the intersections of education, international development, gender, race, in-school pregnancy/student motherhood, refugee education, forced displacement, and qualitative research methods. Her scholarship has received various awards, including the 2024 Gail P. Kelly Award for Outstanding Dissertation, conferred by the Comparative and International Education Society, CIES. Of course, there's so much more I could tell you about Dr. Chinkondenji's impressive career, but we'll drop a link to her bio in the chat so we can get started with our discussion for today. Dr. Chinkondenji has joined me today to discuss her research findings on structural inequalities within educational policies and practices as it relates to the intersection of education, gender, race, and motherhood. Okay, Dr. Chinkondenji, let's get the conversation started. You ready?
Thank you for having me. Yes.
All right. So, AAUW has been awarding international fellowships since 1917, and we have an impressive record awarding them to individuals from over 150 countries. So, you received an international fellowship from AAUW. So, can you think back a bit to that time and tell us how that award impacted your research and your studies at that time?
Yes, absolutely. So, being a recipient of AAUW International Fellowship was really life transforming for me. I applied when I was in my first year of my doctoral program, and that applied for the 2019-2020 academic year. And the support was really helpful in being able to navigate being an international student in the United States, because being here and being international, there are a lot of all these different things that we have to pay for, and also it's just so expensive. And so I really appreciated being able to not worry about the costs related to schooling and doing higher education and focus on my research. And so the year that I was awarded AAUW, I actually was able to do a research study that was really groundbreaking for my scholarship and for my doctoral work. I At that time, I was doing a pilot study when I had the fellowship that focused on the experiences of student mothers in Malawi. And I was looking at how those particular women in that project were able to go back to school, because a lot of the research was showing that a lot of young mothers don't return. And so, because of this fellowship, I was able to do an international project. And this was a phenomenological study, and it was done virtually. And I was able to publish an article from that research. And I was really excited this year in 2024. I got a different award, not just a dissertation award, but the article that I worked on during the fellowship here got an award from CIS as well. And it is the Joyce Kane Award for Distinguished Research on People of African Descent. And so I attribute all of the success and ability to do great scholarship even to my time that I got the award from AAUW.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on your other
Thank you.
award. That's really amazing. So what was
Yeah.
your motivation for taking on this particular subject?
Yeah, that's a great question that I always think about in my educational journey, because even when I interviewed for my PhD, like to do my PhD education, one of the professors asked me why education. And for me, my motivation to pursue education is because of my mother's experience. And so my mom, in Malawi, she went back to school when she was pregnant with her fourth child and after having three babies. And also, she came from like a very low income background. And so, despite the challenges that she experienced, she was able to go back and be able to complete her secondary education after years of being out and being a mom and being a parent. And so when I got into studying my doctoral career, I was like, I want to explore the experiences of women and girls, because in Malawi, I already co-founded a nonprofit organization that specifically focuses on supporting reintegration for girls in rural communities, and at the same time working with girls who left school because they were pregnant or because of poverty. And so thinking about scholarship and research, I was like, I really want to do something that's very specific and also is unique to my positionality as a Malawian woman. And so one of the professors that I had in graduate school was like, Pempho, how about thinking back to your mom's experience? Because that is a really unique perspective to women and girls education. And so that was the beginning of my journey, focusing on in-school pregnancies and student motherhood, because I remember as a little girl, about 7 years old, my mom going back to school, she was actually going to boarding school. And so, seeing my mom leave and then come back because she wanted to pursue the education sort of motivated me to continue this work. And I also see that as part of some of the reasons why I co-founded the nonprofit with my friends and colleagues.
Well, that's amazing. Well, first of all, kudos to your mom. She certainly is an amazing role model. And thank you for sharing, where that internal motivation came from, and the success of your mom and the importance of education was, the spark that really made you want to dig a little bit deeper. I love that. And so if anyone logged on earlier, they heard us chatting a bit about Africa. And, I mentioned the fact that, I have traveled quite a bit in Africa. And I started my journey because I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon. And it's actually what sparked my interest in gender equity. It came from when I was a high school teacher in northern Cameroon. So a great deal of your research has taken place in various parts of Africa. Do you see any similarities in the United States with regard to institutional policies and things like the student motherhood penalty?
That is a great question. And because my scholarship specifically focuses on Africa, I haven't done extensive research to look at in-school pregnancies in the United States. That's actually an upcoming project that I'm hoping to do at the University of North Dakota. I just got my IRB approval, I think yesterday actually, to do a pilot study with refugee adolescents in U.S. Education system here in Grand Forks to look at how they navigate adolescence and motherhood and schooling. However, I do have a set of slides to just speak a little bit more and share about my scholarship with women and girls in Malawi, especially when we think about motherhood and the challenges that they experience. And so I will go ahead and share my screen real quick here. And I also provide a bit of context to motherhood and schooling in the research that I have done.
Great.
All right, can you see my slide over there?
Yes.
All right, great. And so just to situate what is happening, at least in some of the scholarship that I have looked at, in most African contexts, pregnant young women's experiences of schooling are sometimes surrounded by discourses of shame and stigma, especially for teen mothers who get pregnant outside of wedlock. And unfortunately, teachers within the school space, as well as peers in the learning environments, are at times complicit in painting the shame and the ridicule that the young women experience. And so research shows that these practices of exclusion, as well as the negative attitudes that teachers have towards in-school pregnancy and student motherhood, perpetuates a form of dehumanization for these young women and also reduces their agency, which then increases their vulnerabilities of dropping out of school. And so, next slide. So despite the existence of readmission policies, because across sub-Saharan Africa, there are various policies that countries have implemented. And so some of them include readmission policies, others have continuation policies. However, evidence shows that many young mothers do not return to school after pregnancy. And the evidence also shows that some of the policies might not be strong enough to protect the girls and ensure that they return to school. And so, in addition to the hostility that the young women experience, there's also some ambiguities in how policy is framed, and also there's lack of clear, even firm protections and implementations of these policies. And so as such, it continues to perpetuate the push out, and that's what I call it in my research, of pregnant girls within the school space. And so I did a study, and this was the dissertation research that I conducted that won the CIES Outstanding Dissertation Award. And so this study was a participatory project where I worked with young women to be able to examine and describe how pregnant learners and school-aged mothers navigate and negotiate schooling post-pregnancy. And also the goal of this research was for myself and the young women to identify a support framework that ensures continued learning as well as an enabling policy environment. And so this research I felt was really important because it provides evidence-based strategies for supporting pregnant and mothering students in the school space. And at the same time, because of the, as literature is showing, the constant dehumanization and hostility, it was able to address those not just in the school space, but also at home. And in addition, it provided strategies to improve policy, especially within the Malawian context, and then also centering on the young women's voices because of the methodology that I used in this work. And just to, I'll skip that slide just to show you the findings and like some of the things that came out of this work. And again, because this was photo voiced, the young women captured images to represent their lived experiences. And so I had 100 young women who participated in this mixed method study. And the mean age of participation was 19 and the mean age of pregnancy was 17. And so because I did this study in a district that's predominantly Muslim, 88% of my participants identified as Muslim, and 65% of the young women got pregnant while in primary school, which is before you get to high school. And when it came to re-entry, 15%, just 15% of the young women returned to school after delivering their babies. And so you can see that there's a huge percentage that's being pushed out and not being able to go back to school. And I wanted to just highlight like some of the primary reasons why the girls are leaving the school system. And so one of the primary reasons they highlighted was family could not afford to pay for their schooling. And this is because secondary education in Malawi is not free. And so the family, they have to pay out of pocket for that. And because some of them come from lower socioeconomic status, it was hard for them to be able to go back and pay while also take care of childcare, which is why childcare is the second reason why they were not able to go back. And so I'll stop there for now so that we continue in conversation. But I just wanted to share that to help provide some context.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that research and the methodology that you used. I mean, it is unfortunate that that 15% number is an important number, and the impact that it has had on those young mothers. So congratulations once again. So we have a question here that I think is related to that, and the first question is prevention of teen pregnancy a policy? Is there something in place that is implemented? Because
Yeah, that's a good question. So prevention of teen pregnancy, there's no policy that prevents teen pregnancy. The policy that exists within the Malawian context, in terms of schooling and pregnancy, is to provide supports for the girls after they become pregnant if they're in primary and secondary school. And so in Malawi, this policy is called a readmission policy. And so, which I really see this readmission policy as a huge step towards supporting girls' education. Because before 1993, there was an expulsion policy in Malawi, which meant that if a girl got pregnant, that was the end of her education in primary or secondary school. She couldn't go back. And so because of a lot of advocacy and a lot of awareness about the importance of girls' education, the government implemented this new policy, which is readmission, allowing young women to go back to school after pregnancy, which was a great step. And I get this question a lot. Sometimes people ask me about experiences related to before pregnancy, but my scholarship is really after the pregnancy has happened. There's a lot of work that's being done to support teen pregnancy and sexuality. And so my research sort of pushes further and being able to highlight because girls are getting pregnant, and the research is showing, at least in this work that I did with young women in Malawi, that the pregnancies are happening among teens. And so how do we ensure that that is not a cause for the end of their education? And so I'm focusing on this readmission policy to find ways to ensure that not only 15% are going back, we want everyone to return.
Absolutely. And thank you for your efforts, because having a child should not be the end of your educational pursuits. That's really important. So I'm glad to hear that what was in place before changed, to make that accommodation, and not let it be in terms of looking as though you're being punished for that.
And sorry, just to jump in there was a quote actually that I had on a slide. I don't think I shared that quote, but I had a young woman who was emphasizing that having a child shouldn't be a barrier. And that just speaks even to the resistance and the refusal to be othered that the young women are bringing to this experience. And even when I do this work, and again, thinking about representations of African women in mainstream discourse and media, there's a lot of demonization and a lot of damage-centered representations. And so even when I do this work, I'm very intentional about highlighting their agency, because they do have agency, and it might manifest in different ways. And so being able to center on that and highlight their power.
Absolutely. Thank you. Another question is, and then we'll move on to the next one that I had for you, is it says also, what are some of the inherited colonial policies that perpetuate that discrimination against girls?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's actually a whole chapter 2 in my dissertation, where I do like a historical analysis of schooling and pregnancy, especially looking at the legacies of colonial education. And so just to provide a little bit of a history and a background to this work, Malawi was colonized by the British, and so a lot of the values of the English church and the English state were inherited into the formal education system. And some of that incorporated, like for the centrality of educating men. And some of the scholarship, especially for Southern Africa, show that the native girls were deemed as, to be trained as proper wives for Christian converts. So the African people who were converted. And so they didn't really prioritize the education for the girls. Eventually, if the girls were going to end up in the school system, they refused pregnant girls to be part of the schooling system because they felt like that was not aligning with Christian values of being pregnant outside of wedlock. And so a lot of, not just Malawi, Tanzania, and some of the other countries inherited some of those policies that refuse pregnant girls to be in the school space, because even some of the scholarship would say that it was like they would pass it on to other girls. And so, so they were just not accepted within the space. And so there's been a lot of, even right now, policy reform that's been happening, like Tanzania, which also was a former British colony. They recently changed their expulsion policy to do readmission to allow girls to be able to stay. But otherwise, a lot of these former British colonies had the same policies that that pushed out pregnant girls because that did not align with Christian values.
Okay, and so you mentioned about those not attending school. Looking at the primary reasons for not attending school, what did you see was the impact of the Muslim religion on that component of who attended and who didn't?
Yeah, that is a great question that I feel like needs further exploration in this work. Because I selected the district that I did my research. It's called Mangochi. It's in southern Malawi. And I did the research there because the Malawi Ministry of Gender conducted a rapid assessment during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that was in March and July of 2020. And between that period, over 40,000 cases of pregnancy were recorded in Malawi. And Mangochi, the district I worked in, recorded the highest cases. And so that was my rationale for going to that district. And because the district is predominantly Muslim, my data sort of oversampled the Muslim population. However, I'm curious to actually do like a study to be able to see if there are any differences that exist where religion is a factor to that experience, which I don't have the data. So I wouldn't really speak much to that. But I think that that's a potential area of research and exploration.
Okay, great. Thank you. And another question, is there I know that the answer is yes, but I want people to hear. Is there a secondary school cost for men in Malawi or just girls?
Yeah, so secondary education is for, like, paying for it is both for men and women. Primary education is free because of the Education for All movement that happened in the early 1990s to make basic education accessible and free for all. And so that's what led to a free education policy in Malawi. So 1994, we implemented that. So primary schooling is 8 years. And then the secondary school education, you have to pay tuition.
Okay, good.
Everyone needs to.
Okay, I keep saying this is the last question, but this isn't the last question.
That's okay.
Okay, so from a research qualitative methodological perspective, please speak about the instruments you use to gather data from a cross-cultural perspective. I know you mentioned photo voice, so
Right.
if you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, so for I'll give a case or an example for the research. So I'll use the dissertation, for example, in photo voice. And so what I did is to ensure that my methods and mode of inquiry is culturally relevant to the context that I was working in. And so one of the key things that I had to do for this qualitative project was to ensure that I have buy-in from all the different levels of government, especially the Ministry of Education, and the different levels of authority in the communities that I worked in. And so even though I had IRB approval from my university at UMass Amherst, I had to first get ethical approval from the Malawi government, and also being able to make sure that I clearly articulate my process or procedures for research for the Malawi Board of Ethics. And then after that, engaging with the Ministry of Education to have their approval, and then going to the actual community. And so communities are structured to have, like, the villages would have a traditional authority who's the lead or the primary authority in that area. And so I had to meet with them, explain my research process, explain that we're taking photos, because it's strange to just go into a village and start taking images. And so being able to explain the relevance of that work. And they were actually really excited because they want to see their girls succeed and stay in school and complete their education. And so they connected me to what I call them in my research as community mobilizers. And so they'll just introduce me to people and say, if you need help navigating the town, or you just need someone who's aware, who knows what you're doing and that you have our approval, they would assign someone to me who would work with me and just show me around, introduce me to people. So that was really good. And I see this as also being rooted in what in my research I call Ubuntu-centric education, or Ubuntu ways of being, which as African people, we believe that I am because we exist in our collective. And so even my methodology had to embody that. And so I was able to engage with the authorities, and the girls would even connect me to their parents, because we needed to invite parents to an exhibition. As part of the methodology, we had to show all the photos to the community, not all, but the ones the girls selected. And so I did a photo voice exhibition. And so each of the girls identified 2 photos. So I had 50 photos exhibited. And so I had to invite people from the Ministry of Education in the district, invite civil society organizations, and parents and community members. So for me to even be able to pull out something like that in a town that's not my own was hard. And so having this collective nature that, that sort of represents who we are embedded into this methodology made this research process and navigating it easier. And so I think it's always important when we do research methodologically to think about the cultural context that we're working in and the ways in which we want our modes of inquiry to embody that. And so that's what I did.
Thank you. That's a really, really interesting description in the way in which you proceeded to get the information that you needed to get and the methods that you used. Thank you. Did any of the women share about how postpartum issues impacted them? Because could be postpartum depression, it could be low motivation, and all the things that happen, right, once someone gives birth.
Right, absolutely. That is a great question. And that is not something that directly came up in the research. And I wonder if it's because of the naming of postpartum or depression or experience that wasn't named specifically by the young women. And also because all the research was done in my mother tongue, which is Chichewa. And so the experiences and how they were articulated might not have specifically mentioned postpartum depression or those experiences. And that's a good point, because it's making me think of potential areas of as I do this research and ways in which to highlight some experiences based on the lenses that I bring to the work.
Excellent, thank you. So you mentioned the pandemic. So have you observed a greater push for support of student mothers following the pandemic? And what are there any policies that you think are currently still barriers for student mothers?
So from a global scale, based on the research that I have done, I have seen a lot of global experts in gender and education, especially within the field of international education, pushing for supports for schooling post-pregnancy. And this is because the increase in teen pregnancy, especially during or post-COVID-19, has been really huge. And I remember seeing an article from UNICEF, and that was highlighting how South Asia recorded over 400,000 cases of adolescent pregnancy. And there was an article I read by World Vision International. It's an organization that supports girls' education in Africa, among many other things. And they mentioned, and this struck me, they said that because of the pandemic and just thinking about the challenges related to teen pregnancy and the policies that restrain girls from going back to school, their data projected that over 1 million girls in sub-Saharan Africa would be their education would be threatened. And so we see that the global experts who focus on this work are paying attention to this and working with governments and NGOs to be able to identify ways to provide those supports. So far, I haven't come across particular scholarship that's specifically saying that, this is what's being implemented or done, but I have seen in school pregnancy being a priority for a lot of the work that practitioners are doing. I come across an article by Echidna Giving, and they're one of the top funders of education for girls, and they had young mothers' education as a priority. And so we're seeing that being a priority across different sectors. Even governments are reforming their policies. Like Sierra Leone created what they call a radical inclusion policy, where they're intentionally ensuring continuation of girls staying in school. And so there are things like that, which I think are really bringing a massive shift into the education for young mothers in primary and secondary schools who are pregnant or who are pregnant.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much. And hopefully, your research and the work that you are doing, will, in providing that data and information, will have an impact, right, on policies that can be more responsive to the needs of teen girls who are experiencing pregnancy so that they can move forward with their educational pursuits and not be penalized for it. So I want to switch a little bit to your recent article, which highlighted the experiences of Black students at predominantly white institutions. AAUW for a number of years now has been working with a number of historically Black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions on some of our programs. Can you speak a bit about all your findings and around how the socio-political climate impacts how Black students navigate society and campus in relation to safety?
Yeah, so actually the publication that you referenced is part of a project that I was on when I was a student researcher at UMass Amherst, and I was part of a team of Black scholars. And we were trying to explore and examine how Black collegians within US higher education make meaning of contemporary racial issues within US society, especially within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also thinking about how their Black identity on the campuses that they're in. And a lot of our participants were at predominantly white institutions. And so some of the literature that we were thinking with for this project were stemming from the understanding that societal racism is reflected within university campuses. And so how are Black collegians in their diversities? And when we talked about Black collegians, we were thinking about the heterogeneity that exists, knowing that there are some Black collegians who are foreign born, some who are biracial. And so there are all these different identities that make them so different. And so centering on and understanding that Blackness is not a monolith, I think that was really central in our conceptualization of our participant experiences. And so this study, the primary investigators on this research, we had Professor George Christomangi and Professor Ashley Carpenter, who sort of led this study. And so our findings, they were really interesting to see some of the things that the participants highlighted. And one of the things that we saw that I found interesting was that students found COVID-19 as an opportunity to run away from campus racism. And this is because with the pandemic and everything happened, schools were shut down and people had to pivot to online learning. And so we were able to see that students, because of some of the racial or racialized experiences they had on campus, going home felt like going to a place of safety, where they don't have to be able to actively encounter some of the microaggressions and the experiences that they have on campus. And so that was really interesting. And so some of the students talked about how this was a break away from all that they were experiencing. And also some of the things participants talked about was how sometimes they engage in some form of editing, where they have to maybe put on particular clothes, or especially like university gear, so that even when they encounter police on campus, they're able to be automatically recognized as students at the university and not being seen as threats in those spaces. And so those are some of the things that participant narratives highlighted.
Yeah, and I think that you just described sort of how Black students perceived anti-Blackness having an impact on their embodiment of their Black identity.
Right.
Because they needed to, even what they were wearing, right, had an impact.
Right.
Yeah. Were there any other areas that had an impact?
So I think that another thing was just thinking of how in their own lived experiences, intentionally combating mainstream views of Blackness. And so for some of them, even though mainstream representations might be damage-centered, like I also highlighted within pregnant girls' experiences, they were able to take pride in their Black identity and be able to center on resilience and overcoming, and not just highlighting some of the weaknesses, that not just focusing on what might be perceived as negative, but also being intentional about that pride and unique identity that's tied in their hair, their ancestors, or their culture. And so some of those things were things that helped turn those negative experiences and point to a sense of pride.
And so it was described in the events of 2020 as a dual pandemic for Black students. So can you speak more about what that is when you talk about the dual pandemic for Black students?
Right. Like I mentioned earlier, our study was situated within the context of COVID-19. And even during this time, there was this resurgence of national media attention on police brutality and also the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the presence of COVID-19 alongside some of the societal racism that were happening, which again is mirrored within higher education institutions, led to what even other scholars in higher education have called a dual pandemic, where the Black collegians are navigating multiple experiences. They're navigating the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black people, and also at the same time being able to navigate the racial experiences that they have on campus. And so there were different things that they have to navigate at once. And so at the same time, the data was showing that Black people and other minoritized racial groups were actually more impacted by COVID-19 as compared to their white counterparts. And so we're able to see that there were all these things happening at the same time, and so creating multiple pandemics. So you have a health pandemic, and then you also have a racial pandemic. And another interesting thing was that because of the heterogeneity of Blackness, you had foreign-born Black scholars, international students studying in the United States, who also had to either maybe they were studying online, or maybe they came during before the pandemic, being able to be socialized to the racial conceptualizations of being, which was also an interesting concept, because for, say, African students who were born in Africa and come to the US, their conceptualization of race is different. And so they had to come and sort of like be socialized to how that impacts their education and who they are within US society. And so those are some of the things that we're able to hear our participants share.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. So do you think that universities have implemented any systems since then to create a safer environment for Black students, American born or African?
That is a good question that I haven't explored post this research. So I'm not really sure what might be happening at institutions right now. But there are some things that students in this research highlighted in terms of thinking about, creating safe spaces. And maybe we can chat more about that when we get to the next question. But students were very intentional about highlighting even the intentionality with recruitment of students, and even staff at university institutions to ensure representation, and to also think about how do they intentionally retain Black students within higher education systems, thinking about Black students holistically and the different needs that they have, including some of their emotional needs, especially thinking about COVID-19, where students had to, a lot of people were impacted by the pandemic in different ways. Others lost family members. And so thinking about how we can intentionally create those safe spaces and inclusive spaces for the students.
Good. And continuing with that, when you talk about other strategies that could hold institutions accountable for creating these safe campuses for students of color, like what else could be included?
Yeah, and so thinking back to, holistically thinking about Black students, or even just students of color in general, understanding that, when we go back to the idea of the multiple pandemics, this has led to a lot of stress, even mentally, for students, and the mental health crisis, and thinking about the tremendous loss and grief students might have experienced. And so being intentional and investing in even hiring healthcare practitioners that represent who they are. And so maybe investing in hiring Black mental health professionals within universities, or health professionals who are people of color, and also intentionally adopting safety frameworks that specifically address the needs of students of color. And in our research, some of the things that we highlighted was being intentional about relationship. And so maybe looking at how maybe campus police can partner with Black student organizations and universities to ensure that there are workshops that are there for the campus police to learn how to engage with students, especially students of color, and at the same time for the students of color to have maybe workshops and trainings to be able to know how do you respond when you are, when you meet campus police on campus, stuff like that. And so there's just intentionality. And at the same time, one of the things we highlighted in our scholarship was thinking about how not just predominantly white institutions, but also historically Black colleges and universities and all the different institutions, thinking about how anti-Blackness might show up in the things that we do, and thinking of how that might show up in readmission and enrollment, and what can we do to respond to that. And so just thinking of those different elements.
Great, thank you. And so along those same lines, when we think about research on marginalized groups being pushed out or dropping out of higher education, which also clearly can include student mothers, what do you think are the key takeaways that policymakers consider when they need to implement some new and more equitable policies?
Yeah, so in my experience, just more broadly with the research that I have done, I see that centering on the students' voices and their needs is really important because as policymakers, they might have other priorities, but bringing the people into the room and let their voices be heard is really central, as opposed to just utilizing the existing systems and practices that we have, because there's a lot of change that is happening. And so being able to incorporate that in our decision making, and that can only come if we hear the voices of the students. And also one thing that I really find important is engaging with culturally relevant, I don't want to say ontologies, but culturally relevant practices that embody the nature of being for the people that we're working with. And so for me, when I work with pregnant girls in Malawi, if I were to do a study in a different context, so like right now I'm planning to do a study in the US with teens, that's going to be a different experience because the nature of being within the Malawian society is different. And so it's important that we consider that even in making decisions and policies. And even for my scholarship, which is within international education, we have global or international policymakers like the United Nations who are setting priorities for countries in how they strategize their educational policies and practices. And so it's important that there's still that emphasis on culturally relevant policymaking and programming. I think that's really central. And also, I think just engaging in outreach, reaching out to the communities and being able to attract all the different students that might not be able to find us in these institutions. And so going out to them and being able to bring them in as we plan for the different education programs.
Great. Well, I'm glad to hear that you're going to be continuing the research and doing it here on the U.S. side. And it is important to reach out and meet people where they are and give them an opportunity to join. I think we'll have to make sure that you let us know when that research comes out so we can learn about it. So I want to flip back a bit more and go back to your research around the young women in Malawi. We have some additional questions. I think we have some time. If I can get you to answer just a few more, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So here's a comment. Your mom's story is truly inspiring. Thank you for sharing it. Do you plan to trace the journeys of young women who return to school to gain insights into the factors that contribute to both success and challenges in completing their education?
I love that question because one, it gives me an idea of like a research project because I haven't done that. I have, for my pilot study, the very first study that I ever did was work with girls who went back to school because I wanted to understand what made you return. And actually, that specifically, I was looking at the supports and barriers. So that sort of ties to the second, my second part of the response, where I did explore that, but it wasn't as in depth. And so I think I see that as an opportunity for like a narrative inquiry where I do a deeper dive into like 2 or 3 young women and being able to see what are the legacies and the experiences that have shaped their experience. So I think that that would be interesting, but I haven't done that. So I think that would be a good project to explore.
Okay, good. I think our attendees are just going to keep giving you more research ideas, so prepare yourself. Okay. Um, Next is, was your access and support for research the result of more women in positions of authority in Malawian government and politics?
So when I went to the Ministry of Education, I know that I was able to access to the gatekeeper that helped me get into the ministry and get their approval, which I really appreciated because now the government, in their letter of approval, said they would love to see the results of my research so that it can inform their policy and programming, which is great. But there was a woman there who helped me. So I was really appreciative of that, to see women supporting women. I think that's really amazing. Beyond the ministry, when I got into the actual field, a lot of the leaders that I worked with were men, a lot of the traditional authorities. And it was just amazing to see how they are top advocates for women in their community. And specifically for the Photo Voice exhibition and even the trainings that I did with participants, that all took place at a particular like space provided by the traditional authority, like the high-ranking authority in that community. And he was just very enthused about this project and providing the space without even, without charging or anything like that, which I really appreciated. And so I saw that even though, some of the encounters that I had with authority figures, even if they were not women, a majority of them were really supportive to ensure that they advocate for girls in their community.
Well, I'm glad to hear that men also were there, giving their support. I think that's really important because for women, so much, we're all often it's women, preaching to the choir, and really needing men to jump on board as well. So thank you for sharing that. And so the next question is around. Um, did students talk about the complex interplay between the benefits, example, avoiding discrimination, and the challenges, for example, limited resources or isolation, of remote learning in the pandemic? Right? So it's a good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I can answer that in 2 different parts. So the first part is with the study with girls who are pregnant or young mothers, a majority of them were out of school. Like the data showed, only 15% went back to school. And so they really weren't thinking about remote learning because that option wasn't there for them. For them, it was more of desire to return because the infrastructures when they were pregnant and had to leave school were not there to support their reentry. But those who were going, which is something I didn't really share in this conversation, was that a lot of them were attending night school, which might be a foreign concept in the United States, but these are alternative modes of schooling that happen after regular hours of schooling, like after mainstream schooling periods. And so a lot of my participants, they would come to the research project during the day, and then they would have to go back to school at like 4 p.m. And actually in my scholarship, I propose like culturally relevant alternative modes of schooling for young mothers. And night schools are one of them, but also recognizing that night schools are not as strong as they should be. And so being able to invest in those alternative options and supporting girls to go back. So that was the experience. And for these young women, they had to go back in person. And this study was in 2022. So it was like we were all back to in-person learning. So they were still going back. But I did a different study. This was a photo voice project as well, and it was a comparative study between Malawi and Zimbabwe with my colleague, Dr. Nyara Dzai-Changamire. And we looked at emergency remote learning for university students, female university students in public universities in Malawi and Zimbabwe. And so for that study, we were able to see that like the issue of access, even like the digital divide, and this is not just about access to technological equipment, but even the internet, was a huge barrier. And this was attributed also because of the financial gap where they were not able to afford to access some of those material. And so it was amazing to see the different ways in which the students and their professors in these public institutions creating alternative ways of accessing information. So even though they had Moodle as a platform, like a learning management system, they still used like WhatsApp. It's a common application in most African countries. They would use that as a platform to learn. They would engage in groups and do group discussion. So those who are unable to access the internet or do remote learning on the internet, they would help each other to learn remotely. And so I'm excited about that research. We just submitted it to a journal, so hopefully it'll be published and you can be able to read it.
Excellent. You'll have to let us know when that is published and so we can access it. You mentioned that there were some supportive policies and the policy change in Malawi so that girls were, no longer penalized, when they became pregnant and they could certainly continue on pursuing school. So how long do you think that the new supportive policies toward pregnant students will take to sort of change people's attitudes towards these young women? Do you think that a shift has already occurred?
I think that a shift is in progress, but it hasn't fully occurred. And even the policy change that happened in 93, I feel like it's just one step because the current policy that we have, which is readmission, there are several parts of it that I feel like could be better and could be improved. So like one of the framings in the policy is you have a once in a lifetime opportunity to go back to school post-pregnancy. So if you have a second pregnancy, that implies that based on the document, you can't really go back. And so there are a lot of parts that I think can be improved. And also, I think that change goes beyond policy. I think that for us to see a shift in perceptions and how the communities are either open or closed to pregnant girls and student mothers in the school space involves even a lot of community mobilizing. And also thinking, and this is why I always go back to the socio-historical factors that shape our current day experiences and policies and say that we need to decenter some of those colonial practices that have shaped our contemporary education systems and then change policy. That's a great step, but also we need to engage in active community engagement. And I'm sure that's something that can take a long time, but all those different layers have to occur, at least to be able to see a paradigm shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in your research on sort of what shaped the experiences of these young women with pregnancy, were you able to explore how and by whom they became pregnant and sort of how that also shaped their pregnancy and their postnatal experience?
Yes, so in terms of people responsible for the pregnancy, there are different experiences. For some girls, it was just maybe boys in their school. For some girls, not in my research, but in some other scholarship, like there's a scholar that I engaged with in her work, Professor Divya Bana from South Africa. Her research also points to even experiences of like teachers being responsible. And so there's a really a huge difference in the experience. And so policies like the Malawian policy will speak to the boy responsible who's also a student. And so there are penalties in place within the policy for boys responsible, but it doesn't speak about if a teacher is responsible. And so then that creates, like a layer within the policy that has to be addressed. And so for some of the young women in this study, the men who were responsible were not even students. So, how do you address that? So even in the study, the community wanted that to be addressed, and they were coming up with their own solutions for their community. How do we address this? And some of them were talking about going to the police and, all those things that ensure that those men who make the girls pregnant and don't take responsibility are penalized for that. But I didn't really, in this research, I didn't spend a lot of time like doing a deeper dive into fathers or fatherhood in this phenomenon of schooling and pregnancy. But I know that some of my other colleagues who do this research have started to dig into that.
Thank you. Yeah, because another question that was raised was sort of what was the male engagement, with these issues, because they certainly played a role for sure.
Absolutely. And again, because this is a qualitative study that does not aim to make generalizations about the phenomenon, but there were men who were really supportive. In my study, one of the participants shared how the boyfriend went to South Africa to get a job in order to make money to support the baby and to support the mom to go back to school. There were some girls who said the men were never there. And so there was no support. So they were only being supported by their parents. And some girls were abandoned by their parents because they got pregnant. So they had to find help elsewhere. So their grandmothers would take them on. So there's really a difference in the experience. And so being able to recognize, once we at least from a policy standpoint, if we know the heterogeneities that exists related to the experience, and that means that would even be reflected in the policies that we make, and not just limited to like schoolboys responsible for pregnancy, but the wide experiences that are there.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and that's a very important point, for sure. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Okay, so through the lens of well-being, how would you define the primary aspects of wellness which characterized your research candidates from a cross-cultural perspective?
Well-being. I think that's a good point. And I would say from a cross-cultural point, well-being would be perceived and conceptualized differently. Of course, there are core elements that are the same. I would add that, and speaking to the Malawian context, for these young women, I would say that there are different parts that are important to consider, thinking about their mental health, considering they're really young. And so how do we ensure that they're supported? And I had a participant who got pregnant, I think when she was 13 or 14. And so how do you ensure that she's supported and also the baby is supported? And so there's that part. And I would say they're just different elements to it, but I would say within the Afrocentric context of this work, I think a lot of it ties back to the collective, even for the individual well-being. And so how does the society, because some girls, it's beyond family, because the family might not even be there. So how do they work together with the young woman to be able to ensure that she's supported? And so the Malawi policy, as a response to some of those gaps that exist, when they made a revision, they incorporated an element of well-being in there by specifically embedding like counseling for young mothers within the school space. And so that's a great development, because then they have people at the schools that they're able to talk to. And research is showing that not all teachers are discriminatory. There are a lot of them that also exist who are supportive. And so some of those work together. And at the same time, the burden of teaching and counseling, because not all schools have counselors. And so how do you ensure that you really have comprehensive support?
That's really great. So thank you so much, Dr. Chinkondenji, for sharing your insight and your research and your upcoming research with our attendees today. We appreciate learning about all the impact and the efforts that you are working with girls in Malawi and other countries, and also working with Black students here in the United States, and coming up with some research and information that will make them have more positive experiences and be able to, increase the retention. I think that's really important. And so a number of folks have wanted to know how they can contact you or find out more about your research. So we're going to share that information as well so that they know if they want more information where they can get it. Just remind everyone that the recording will be available on the AAUW website. I want to thank the AAUW team for your support today in order to make this happen. And I encourage everyone to visit AAUW.org to learn how you can join, give, learn, advocate, and engage with AAUW. So Dr. Chinkondenji, we're going to give you the last word to close us out.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share about my research. And I'm also thankful for AAUW for just being an amazing resource for me when I was in graduate school. And just I'm so grateful for the fellowship and for everything.
Thank you for being with us, and thank everyone for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you.